On day 173, I'm going to start by reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verses 3 through 6. Remember, this is the Old Testament, so this was roughly 700 years before Jesus came on this earth. It says, starting in verse 3, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we were healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Goes on in verse 7 to say, "He was opposed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." How prophetic is that? 700 years before Jesus came and died, those words were written in Isaiah. It says in the Application Study Bible, how could an Old Testament person understand the idea of Christ dying for our sins, our inequities and transgressions, actually bearing the punishment that we deserved? Like, how could they understand that 700 years before? It says the sacrifices suggested that this idea, but it's one thing to kill a lamb and something very different to think of God's chosen servant as that lamb. But God was pulling aside the curtain of time to let the people of Isaiah's day look ahead to the suffering of the future Messiah and the resulting forgiveness that was made available to all mankind. So like they were already being forgiven, it sounds like, of their inequities and transgressions at that time for something that was about to happen 700 years later, Jesus dying for the atonement of sin. And that's so wild. It's like our human minds want to try to make such like human logical sense of things, but like God does not operate in space and time. He is, the more that I read this stuff, like it's revealed and understood in my mind of like, I just don't fully understand. And we can't, it's just interesting. It's like, who am I as a human to think that God should work this way or that way when God doesn't operate in space and time? His ways are above our own. His understanding is above our own. Like the way that I would liken it to is, I don't think the walls of this house that's behind me, this drywall, I don't think that they have any mental capacity to tell the builder and the architect how to design this house. That's just as silly as it would be for me to question the ways of God and the ways of Jesus. But anyways, back to the original topic of this was 700 years before this book of Isaiah being written in the Old Testament, before this played out in real time, where Jesus faced rejection. He faced this suffering that was very clearly described in Isaiah chapter 53. And Isaiah, the quote that I looked up online that relates to it, or just like the way that they put it, I thought was interesting. Substitutionary atonement, like that Jesus had to come and pay the debts, and in order to do that, in order to atone sin, he had to die. That's the only way that we were to be off the hook for the sin of humanity that humans created. Someone had to pay that debt. One time it was explained to me, like if you go to a restaurant and you rack up $1 million bill from a 1,000 people party at a restaurant, at a fancy restaurant, it's like someone's got to pay the tab. Like if you don't have the money and they come to you after the meal and says, well, the penalty is you're going to be thrown in prison for stealing, or someone has to come and pick up the tab. So like, I think that's an interesting way that it was explained to me of like Jesus, because some people don't understand, or they ask like, well, why did it all have to happen that way? and again, we try to think of this logically. In some ways, we won't have the answer because we're only human, and like I established before, God's ways are higher than ours. But I think in some ways we can logically think through that idea of, look, if you rack up a debt that you cannot pay, someone has to come in and pay that, or you will face a serious consequence. And in this case, in the Bible, the consequence was death, eternal death. But it'd be like just that restaurant example I talked about. If you rack up $1 million bill and no one can pay the tab, but someone pops in at the 11th hour and says, hey, I've got it, I am going to pay the tab, then you are let off the hook for that debt that you had racked up. So instead of facing jail time, the restaurant example, you'd be free to go. Jesus paid the tab and tipped and more by going to the cross for us, so we could escape the debt that humans had created. So again, I thought that was beautiful. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 through 6, and really beyond that, within chapter 53, it just really prophetically explains the rejection, suffering, and substitutionary atonement that Jesus, that was showing of who was going to come and save us all, which again prophetically explains the pinnacle, or the crucial turning point of the Christian faith, which is Jesus going to the cross, dying for our sins, rising 3 days later, defeating death, so that we may live in eternity with him. And that's day 173.